Hello, happy Friday. We've just got to the end of our first full week here at college, and with my Year 12 students, we've just finished our sort of introduction to the course. And what we end with is a look at how different contexts can be relevant when analysing media products. And it's kind of along this theme that I'm going to talk about a radio programme that was on yesterday. Context is always a tricky one to explain. I think it's quite an abstract idea, and it's really the sort of thing that you can only understand from doing it. And of course, the context that we look at within the specification for Media Studies A-Level are historical contexts, social and cultural contexts, economic contexts, and political contexts. And it's that last one that we're going to focus on today as we consider how political contexts have an impact on the news, and in particular, the impartiality of news and how news can remain impartial in a society and in an era where everything is so polarised and binary and argumentative and challenging, and also where social media plays such a huge part. So it's to do with politics and news, really. So for those of you who are in Year 12, hopefully this will feel relevant to what we've been talking about this week. And for those of you in Year 13, we've already studied newspapers, and it would be useful for you to think about this and listen to the show that I'm going to talk about, to just revisit newspapers and think about ownership and think about the ideology of the newspapers that we've studied. Now, the show itself is called Impartial Journalism in a Polarised World, and it was a Radio 4 broadcast. It's on the iPlayer now. I'll link to it below, and of course you can listen to that if you have the BBC Sounds app. Before I talk about the show, just a bit about how I put these together. I usually record my little ramble chat where I kind of don't really think of too much planning ahead of time. You'll be shocked to hear. And then usually put a couple of photos together on the bottom, and the link to whatever I'm talking about, and then think of a title that sort of somewhat corresponds to what I've been chatting about. Today I chose a title before starting recording this, and so that's why I've decided to call this "This is my truth, tell me yours," which was a quotation that sort of sprang to mind when I was listening to the Radio 4 show, because it's very much about how people's opinions can shape and form their representation of reality, and the dangers of that and the necessities of it, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason I'm aware of that quotation is mostly because, and this is my own cultural touchstone, of 1998 album by the band the Manic Street Preachers, who, if you know them, are a kind of very political and highly charged indie band from the 90s. They're still sort of kicking around, playing and writing music. I believe they had an album out last year. And it will be no surprise to those of you who know them that the title of that album is actually a quotation from the Labour politician Nye Bevan, who was the sort of founding father, if you like, of the National Health Service. But it is an important quotation. It helps us understand really what the Radio 4 show is about. And it is that look at how ideology can sometimes filter into and disrupt and distort news, and how do you stay impartial when everything is so polarised. And there's a few topics that come up because of this that maybe you think about and want to comment, and maybe are relevant to the different aspects of the course we've chatted about so far. The first one is really about how technology has altered news and the demands that there are for instant 24-hour accessible news, possibly because of social media, the Twitter and other social media networks and forums, that meant that news has become very, very fast. It's become very piecemeal, very sort of collapsed, startling comments, outrageous clickbait, essentially, in news form. And there is a campaign headed up by a guy called James Harding to slow news down. He has a website called Tortoise that he runs with other journalists. It's a kind of Kickstarter that is all about slow news, long form journalism, making sure there is context to news so that it can be understood, so that people get a much better picture and idea. And it's a really interesting idea, and it's interesting to see if that makes a comeback or whether we've gone too far on whether people will always want their news instantaneously. Of course, what happens when you have longer form journalism or any kind of long form journalism is it gives the opportunity to bring in a variety of arguments. And this is one of the other aspects of the documentary, if you like, the radio show that comes up. These days, there seems to be such an onus, such a demand for there to be a balanced argument, which seems fair and it seems like a good idea. But there is a criticism that this is taken to the extreme, whereby in order to get a range of different opinions, you end up with a lot of experts, perhaps on one side, but then you end up with people who have maybe quite extreme views on the other, just in order to present the idea of balance. The example they give within the documentary is if you were to debate science or astronomy, you could have, would you have Stephen Hawking on one side, which sounds pretty fair. He's, he was obviously one of the most important physicists of his time. But would you have a flat earther on the other end of the argument? Someone who is, demonstrably and clearly over millennia been proven to be wrong in their views. But should you have both on, because that's a balanced argument? And this is something that's discussed and debated within the show. It's a debate, essentially, the show. It has BBC's Helen Lewis, ITV's Robert Peston, Mark Mardell, who I believe is a BBC journalist, then the talk radio host Julia Hartley-Brewer, and Vice, the website Vice, their editor Gavin Hughes. So it's a real sort of cross spectrum of different mainstream media journalists and writers, and of course that, you may argue, leaves out some of the more fringe journalists, and of course they do talk about that too. What happens when the fringe journalism becomes more mainstream? How important or dangerous is an Alex Jones from InfoWars and so on. So it's a real interesting dissection of how news is presented and how ideology is embedded as well. Being a BBC show, of course, they do discuss the nature of the BBC itself and how it's been under attack for being biased towards one side. Usually the criticism from within certain circles is that the BBC is maybe too liberal and too Remainer-based in its views. However, interestingly, when I was doing a little bit of research about this show, some of the reviews of this documentary suggested that the panel were far too Brexity for this to ever be impartial. So my opinion of this, and you'll have heard it if you've heard me talk about BBC before, is that whilst everyone is criticising and attacking the BBC, then it's probably remaining impartial. Although to my amusement, this is an argument that gets brought up and somewhat dissected actually on the show itself. So just finally, a couple of things to think about while you're listening to this. Think about the BBC's public service broadcast remit, its responsibilities as a public service broadcaster, to be impartial but to reach and to express the views and realities of people across the country. Think about Curran and Seaton, which I know if you're in Year 12 probably doesn't mean much to you, but looking at ownership of media, looking at how the media can be influenced by its ownership, and of course the cultural industries theory of David Hesmagulch, who talks about how ideology can impact on output of media as well. So if you're in Year 12, I know some of those things might not have made much sense, but do listen to it, do have a think about these things in relation to context, and of course you should, as media students, be listening and reading and keeping up with news and current affairs as we go along. But for Year 13s, I think this is an excellent opportunity for you to maybe develop your understanding of some of those key industry theories, and maybe even think about representations of reality or representations of issues and current events as well. So listen to the show, tell me what you think. I'll be interested in your opinions on both the subject matter that's covered as well as how the show deals with that subject matter itself. And apart from that, have a lovely weekend. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.